Hello everybody, Willingdone here, and today we're going to be looking at a game that I recently played, in which I was playing as Jinteki Personal Evolution, and my opponent was playing a Noise deck. The goal of this video is to share with you some of the thoughts behind the various decisions I make throughout the course of the game, and we're really going to focus on the way that I play the corporation here, and not focus too much on what my opponent's doing. Getting into the game, the first decision we have to make is whether or not we should mulligan this hand. While this hand could be better, it could also be a whole lot worse. We have a piece of ice, which is not bad, and another defensive card in the form of Hokusai Grid. We also have two agendas that we'd like to score pretty early in the game. I'm going to elect to keep this hand and to draw the first card of the game. Sansan City Grid is definitely a card that we would prefer to draw later in the game, but it does give us a few options here. If we're worried about a count siphon on the first turn, we could put Pop up in front of HQ and install the Sansan City Grid to one of our remote servers. That way, if he runs HQ with Siphon, we'll gain a credit and be able to spend all of our credits on the Sansan. I'm not too worried about Siphon out of Noise. I've seen some Noise decks use Siphon, but I think most of them aren't using a count siphon. So I think I'm going to explore lines of play that aren't this one. As I see it, our two main options are to defend our two centrals with Pop-Up and Hokusai Grid, or to play down 3 remotes on the first turn. Since we don't really have any economy options other than the Gilahan's Arcology, I think we want to try to score that as quickly as possible. So I'm going to use all 3 clicks to put down Gilahan's, the Shock, and the Sansan City Grid all into 3 different remotes. My opponent runs R&D and sees a blank card, and then installs Shahrazad, Cash, and Aesop's Pawn Shop, a really strong economic start for Noise. The Noise ability milled another copy of Hokusai Grid, and that's pretty fortunate for us since we already have one in hand. Our mandatory draw is Yagura, and this is a really nice draw because it's going to give us something else to defend our central servers. We'd better score the Gilahan's before our opponent gets too curious here, so I'm going to go ahead and score that even though it's going to bring us down to 2 credits. After the Personal Evolution Zap ability, our opponent only has 1 card. This is really going to limit his ability to run on the next turn. Our opponent spends the first 2 clicks drawing cards, and then runs R&D and sees a Gilahan's Arcology, which he scores. After he gets zapped from the scoring, he draws another card, and it's our turn again. Our mandatory draw is Chronos Project. This card's not going to be useful for quite some time. Our opponent's in a pretty good position to make runs next turn, since he has a whole bunch of credits and quite a few cards in hand. So I think it's mandatory that we get up to the credit range where we'll be able to pay for things like Snare. So I'm going to use the Gilahan's and then install Yagura over R&D so that we can begin defending the central servers. Our opponent draws a card, then runs our Sansan and trashes it. Then he runs the other remote server and sees a shock and elects to leave it there. Finally, he draws 1 more card. Our mandatory draw is Snare, and that's really useful because we can put it down into remotes later and use it for right now to defend our HQ a little better. Eventually, we're going to want to play down 3 remotes to help get these agendas scored, but I think for now we just want to defend our R&D a little better. I'm going to put the Hokusai there and then use Gilahan's to get us some more credits. Our opponent draws a card and then installs Imp. The Noise ability forces us to mill a clone retirement, which is unfortunate. Click 3, he runs HQ and unfortunately gets our House of Knives. Luckily, the Personal Evolution ability zaps a Parasite out of his hand. As his final click, he draws a card. Our mandatory draw is Hedge Fund. As lame as it might initially seem, I think our best play is just to purge the Imp here. This helps keep our HQ safe while also defending the Hokusai Grid that we have on R&D. Plus, we're not in a big hurry here, and we'd really like him to run into the Snare or the stuff on the R&D. Our opponent trashes the purged Imp to Aesop's and then draws a card as his first click. On click 2, he runs R&D. This lets us res the Yagura and resolve both subroutines. When we peek at the top of R&D, we see a fetal AI. The temptation might be to let him score this here, but since he has plenty of credits and plenty of cards in hand, I don't think we want to be so quick to give away 2 points. I'm going to opt to put the Fetal on the bottom of our deck and let him access a different card. We get our opponent for a net damage, and then after he elects to access, we're going to res the Hokusai grid as well. Our opponent sees a blank card and then chooses to trash our Hokusai grid. Our opponent then runs HQ and accesses our hedge fund. For his final click, he draws a card. Our mandatory draw is the Bako that our opponent saw on R&D. It's pretty likely that he's going to have a Parasite or just something to deal with our Yagura, so I think we need to reinforce R&D this turn. Our 2 choices are either the Bako or the Pop-Up. We'd much rather see the pop-up on R&D since he's probably going to run that more times than he is like HQ or a remote. And a lot of noise decks are going to be dealing with these ice with parasites or AI breakers and not a dedicated code gate breaker. I'm going to put the pop-up on R&D and then click Gila Hands for credits. Our opponent draws a card and then installs another imp. The noise ability gets a pop-up window. On click 3, our opponent's going to run our undefended HQ. He accesses the hedge fund that he's already seen, but this time he can trash it with the imp that he just installed. As his final click, he plays Inject. He reveals Clone Chip, Hades Shard, and Nerve Agent. This is a really solid inject for our opponent. He gets 2 really active clone chips and the Hades Shard, which is going to be good later in the game. If we take a look at his heap, we see that he has some really high quality targets with the clone chips. Our mandatory draw is Clone Retirement. This is a pretty excellent draw because we know that our opponent has a really juicy hand and we'd really like to take a crack at it with net damage. If we're going to score the Clone Retirement, we might as well install it over the shock so that we can get the shock to our archives. The Personal Evolution Zap gets the Hades Shard, and this is exactly what we were hoping to do with this play. My opponent opts to trash the imp to Aesop's, draws 2 cards, and then installs both of the clone chips down. Our mandatory draw is Koma Inu. Now that our opponent has the 2 clone chips, we need to worry about our R&D ice getting parasited. Once Yagura gets parasited, we're probably not going to be seeing fresh cards off of R&D until we defend it more thoroughly. I think we should take this opportunity to draw an additional card, just so that we can see another card that our opponent hasn't seen yet. As our first click, we draw a card and see our really good friend Jackson Howard. We can use our last 2 clicks to install both the Snare and the Chronos Project, and hopefully score the Chronos Project before our opponent uses the clone chips. If our opponent uses the clone chips, then we're pretty cool with him running the remotes since the Chronos Project will be kind of dead at that point. At the end of our turn, our opponent uses a clone chip to get back cash. The noise ability gets a Jackson Howard. After both using cash and trashing it to Aesop's, our opponent's got quite a few credits they can use to run against us. As his first click, our opponent plays a Parasite from hand on our Yagura, and that mills Philotic Entanglement, our most important agenda. As his second click, our opponent runs R&D. Since we have Koma Inu in hand, I think we want to get him to use the Parasite here, so I'm going to res the pop-up and see if he'll fall for it. Our opponent takes the bait and uses up the clone chip to get back a Parasite. The noise ability mills a Neural EMP. Our opponent gets an access and he sees Fetal AI. He's able to score it, but it wipes out the rest of his hand, so he's going to have to use his last 2 clicks to draw cards. Our mandatory draw is San. With R&D undefended and the winning 3 points in our archives, our hand kind of plays itself this turn. We're going to have to install something to defend R&D, and we really need to get Jackson into play as well. Since we can pretty easily afford it, and our opponent is running low on cards, I think Koma Inu is the best choice for the R&D defense. So we're going to go Hedge Fund, Koma Inu on R&D, and install Jackson Howard as our last click. Our opponent draws a card and then runs R&D. This to me signals the first signs of desperation from our opponent. Notice how unwilling he is to run our remote servers and has been focusing on R&D extensively. He's got to guess that we have a Jackson Howard in play. It seems to me like his goal is to brute force the Jackson Howard, he's probably going to try to get a couple more of the noise activations off, and then just try to run archives either in the next turn or the turn after. It seems like he's using this play to get into R&D once or twice more, and hopefully get the 1 or 2 points he needs to guarantee an archives win. While we res the Koma Inu here, it's kind of a no-brainer. Our opponent's pretty low on cards, and we just need to hit him and stop him here. He's going to have to jack out after he gets hit with the Koma Inu, and he's going to spend the rest of his turn just drawing a couple more of his few cards remaining. Our mandatory draw is House of Knives. Since our opponent seems really skittish about running on our remote servers, I think I'm just going to put the House of Knives down and use Gila Hands. On his first click, our opponent plays Inject and mills 3 programs and gets the last remaining clone chip. Again, this looks pretty desperate to me, but I'm guessing he's trying to find like Deja Vu or just some other recursion effects, and he did get the clone chip. Clicks 2 and 3, our opponent draws 2 more cards, probably looking for the Deja Vu I was talking about, and then he installs the clone chip. Before ending his turn, our opponent makes a pretty sharp move. He just goes ahead and uses the clone chip to get back a Parasite, puts it on our Koma Inu. I'm guessing he's anticipating that we have a Chronos project in play, or he just doesn't want to risk having the clone chip invalidated. The noise ability mills a fetal AI, and this is pretty critical. Now we know where all of the 2-point agendas in our deck are. There's the fetal AI and the Philotic in our archives, the fetal AI that our opponent scored, and earlier in the game with Yagura, we saw a fetal AI and put it on the bottom of our deck. We haven't shuffled since then. So at this point, the 2 losing scenarios that we have in this game are our opponent running archives with 6 agendas present, or our opponent first scoring a few points on R&D and then running archives with more than 3 agendas present. Our opponent has about 10 cards left, so really all we have to do is weather the storm until he runs out of cards. Our mandatory draw is Neural EMP, and this is a welcome sight. We want to have at least one of these in our hand towards the end of the game. Since our plan is to leverage his low card total, it's kind of a no-brainer to score the House of Knives here. At the beginning of our opponent's turn, the Koma Inu dies to the Parasite. He's going to draw 2 cards, and then he's going to run our newly undefended R&D. After he chooses to access, we're going to hit him with the House of Knives. Luckily, he sees a blank card, although the best case scenario for him here would just be a 1-pointer. Last click, he draws a card. For our mandatory draw, we get to see the blank that our opponent just saw, and it's Archer. As cool as Archer is, this isn't really what we want to defend R&D. Our opponent doesn't have any programs in play, and this is just going to be an overcosted end the run ice against him. I think the better play is just to install the Bako on R&D, and then use Gila to make sure that we stay high in credits. For his first click, our opponent draws a card, and then second click he runs R&D. I think our opponent's assuming that we put the Archer there, and that we might not be willing to res it, but we're going to easily res this Bako to keep him out. We're also going to get him with the House of Knives. For his last 2 clicks, our opponent draws a card, and then installs a cache. The noise ability gets a clone retirement, so now we have 4 agendas in our archives. Our mandatory draw is Shock, and this is a pretty unexciting draw. At this point of the game, I noticed that my opponent only has 1 Deja Vu in his discard pile, and that makes me think that he's probably trying to dig for the other 2 copies that are still in his deck. This would be a perfect time to score our in-play Chronos project. Our opponent trashes the cache and then draws 3 cards. This leaves him with 1 card left in his deck. His final click is installing Crypsis. The noise ability gets a shock, and that works out very well for us since that's where we want the card anyway. Our mandatory draw is our last copy of Hokusai Grid. By playing the Crypsis, it's pretty clear that our opponent is going to make a Desperation last grab to run both the archives and the R&D in one turn. We need to get the Hokusai Grid on the archives just so he takes some more damage when he accesses. After that, we're going to use Gila Hands to make sure that we can both res the Hokusai Grid and play the Neural EMP. This is looking to be the last turn for our opponent. For his first click, he's going to draw his last card, and his second click, he's going to run archives. I think his goal of running archives first is to force us to use Jackson and hopefully shuffle in some agendas that he might be able to pull on R&D. after he commits to the access, we're going to want to unload on him. First, we're going to hit him with the House of Knives, res the Hokusai grid, and we're also going to use the Jackson Howard. Interestingly enough, we don't want to Jackson back all of the agendas here. If we let him score both of the clone retirements, he'll have 0 cards left. Then the only way we can lose is if he gets a 1-pointer out of R&D. With no cards left, our opponent's going to desperately make 2 more runs to try to win. First, he's going to run our last remote server, and that's just a snare that we can't pay for. The bad pub that he gained from the clone retirement is going to let him break the Baco and get into R&D one more time. The only way we can lose here is if he gets a 1-point agenda. Fortunately, he accesses Fetal AI, and that's the end of the game for our opponent. If he had hit a blank card, we could just finish him with the Neural EMP next turn anyway. But our opponent did an excellent job of giving himself a chance to win. It really came down to that last access. Well, that's going to do it for the game. I hope that this gave you some insight into how I play this Corporation deck, and I think my opponent played really well against it, being very careful that he always had enough cards when he was accessing. All in all, I think this was a pretty well played game on both sides, and it was a pretty interesting and long game as well. Thanks for watching, and if you liked the video, please press subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again for some more Netrunner stuff.